Hey there, friends. Welcome back to Hawkeye Speaks. Hope you're doing well today. A little eclipse special. Actually, I don't know if this is the eclipse special. This is just a few thoughts. A few thoughts about Nate Hagens and the Great Simplification. Now, Nate Hagens is alright, and I honestly feel like he's probably doing his best. I don't think that the man has bad intentions. But I've heard him say that he doesn't have time to read a lot of books or listen to a lot of other people's podcasts. And he has clearly said that he likes to have people on his podcast that agree with him and that he agrees with. And that right off the bat, that presents some huge problems. You're trying to cover really complex issues like the energy metabolism of the earth and, these issues around human behavior and impact on the planet. And he's coming out of finance. He was a professional in finance before I guess he had a job teaching for a while. And he says that he has a background in ecology, but this is the one thing that really gets me about Nate Hagens is that I don't think that the man understands ecology. And one time he had a roundtable discussion about that, and he asked his guest to define ecology, if I'm remembering correctly. And that may be a good sign that, hey, do people even know what this word means, or does it even have any meaning in our society? And there's something that I've run across in my studies is that it's due to the specialization and the compartmentalization of sciences and of knowledge within the West, in the world as a whole, that ecology suffered a lonely death, right along with philosophy in a lot of ways. And philosophy used to be about the fundamental principles of nature. But to me, ecology is the interconnectedness and the interdependency of organisms. It is the fundamental principles of nature and the way that life works together to create a web that is nature. And this brings up, if you ever go back to my very first video on YouTube, is I present the question, is nature alive? And that is, of course, based on my own interest and feeling about this matter, but also based on the work of Rupert Sheldrake and an interview that he had while he was being interviewed by Re-mystify. I don't watch their podcast so much or at all anymore because, just like I was saying about Hagens, these people are so biased. My goodness. And it's great. It's great to interview a lot of different smart people, which is what both of these folks do on their podcasts. And find a lot of clever and qualified people that have credentials in their field of expertise, and interview them, and they try to be broad. They interview people from different sectors, all in both of these are kind of different podcasts. Re-mystify actually had Nate Hagens on the show not too long ago, and I thought it was just a terrible episode. One of the reasons why I stopped watching their show. But the real point is to say that these people both, the couple of Re-mystify, Shiloh and Anastasia, and Nate Hagens, these people are very biased. They have, though they would portray that they're open-minded and trying to investigate the issues from a very broad and open perspective. Wow, they are very, very biased, and it's just the way that it is because people are only able to speak within the context that they exist within. That is just the way it works. We're all objectified through the information that we gain as children from our parents, from our schooling, and then most people have had higher education, which really indoctrinates them into certain ways of thinking, and then have had careers, long or brief. That is something that I bring to the table, is that I had almost none of those things. Of course, I have parents, father's deceased, mother's still living. But they didn't indoctrinate me too much as a child. They had different views, and because my father passed away young and my mother was off doing her own thing, I ended up being able to kind of form my own views based on interactions with a variety of humans. That would be the family, but also my very limited amount of schooling experience. I have only an 8th grade education, but mind you, that doesn't prevent me from debating with any professionals of any field at this point. I have become an autodidact over the years and have read hundreds and hundreds of books and listened to thousands and thousands of lectures. And again, like I was saying about Hagens, he says he doesn't have time for that. And okay, I got you. That's great. But any of us that are trying to actually investigate these issues with an open mind and really truly look for solutions, you better be careful. And one thing, the reason kind of why I'm making this little talk right now is I made a comment on Nate Hagens' last video saying Nate Hagens is ecology blind. And I don't like to just I certainly don't like to make ad hominem attacks against anyone. And like I said, personally, I have no problem with Nate Hagens. I don't know him personally. But professionally, I know he's getting funding for that show. And why would he be getting funding, and even, probably quite a bit of funding from the way that it looks? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that is because the narrative that he puts forward is exactly what globalists, depopulation agenda globalists, would want to be put forward. Okay? So what I was about to say is that all of us who are really endeavoring to find solutions and how to employ solutions within the community and society and the world as a whole, got to be very careful to listening to any one individual or set of individuals. And again, this is how I've been able to form such a comprehensive view, is because I have listened to so many different sources over the years. And someone replied to my comment and asked me to elaborate, and I did. I elaborated a bit on what I view to be ecology, and I guess they found that to be interesting and asked me for some recommendations. Who should I follow that really has a good bottom-up approach about ecology? Because that's one thing I suggested, is that it's great to interview, like I just said, a lot of smart people, a lot of qualified individuals, but what we really need is a bottom-up approach. And so this person asked me, who do I recommend? And well, that's a good question, isn't it? Because who do I recommend? Well, I recommend you guys watch my videos. Hey, and I am working diligently. I'm doing my best to continue my studies so that I can continue learning more, but also so that I can learn how to articulate things that I've already experienced and taken into my heart and my knowing. My personal background, just very briefly, is that I have been living off the grid in a sustainable house, and I built sustainable houses 25 years ago. But even before that, I grew up in the country around farming, and then went on to be a professional horticulturalist myself, organic. I've done composting. So I have a bit of experience with living outside of the box and living actually sustainably. Not like the buzzword sustainable. But then about, at this point, 7 years ago, I began actually more intensively studying. And as I had mentioned, I didn't go to school. I have no higher education. But I've read a bit throughout my life, read books, and I decided to start intensively studying and intently studying about 7 years ago now, really. And I started with soil health, and this is after a 10-year career in horticulture. But the knowledge around soil health wasn't even there yet. I mean, the stuff around like the microbiome was just coming out. Of course, Elaine Ingham had been doing her soil food web work since the 70s, but she wasn't really broken out into the public yet, and her wisdom wasn't being shared by a lot of different people. Of course, I had heard of permaculture many times, but I hadn't fully integrated that knowledge into wisdom. And it took going down the road of studying soil health, and then some real doors began to open for me. One of the things that happened is I realized, as I was studying Korean natural farming, I had a big realization, which was that every decision we make and action we take has a profound implication on all life, in that we are either creating or destroying biological life. Okay? And then fast forward to today, studying philosophy, I just recently read, I have not actually read the source materials, but I just recently read that the French philosopher Gouillet was very into the principle of fecundity. And this is something that I speak about because I've gone on to study from the soil health. I studied land management, and I learned about holistic land management, regenerative and adaptive grazing practices. And then I studied human health. I happened to be already studying human health for about a year. I was and I was starting to write about it too. I still haven't finished a book, but I was writing about microbiome health and metabolic resiliency, or whichever way you say it. But in any case, I was studying. I was reading books, reading papers, and listening to lectures, and listening to a wide variety of educators. Okay, so fast forward, like I say. And to continue these studies over the last 4 or 5 years, I have I continued studying soil health. I follow agronomists and regenerative agriculture podcasters and professionals such as John Kemp, such as Living Web Farms. That was a great channel. I don't know how much they're still doing. Such as the Bionutrient Food Association with Dan Kittredge. The man is brilliant. Great show. And currently Matt Powers with Regenerative Soil, great educator. He is a student of Elaine Ingham, and to me he's taken it a step further. He's very brilliant, and he speaks about bottom up, grassroots, okay? And also, within the ranching, I follow Greg Judy, the regenerative rancher. I follow, of course, Alejandro Carrillo when it comes to reversing desertification. But putting all of these pieces together into a whole, the holistic viewpoint, one of the things that I've realized in the book that I'm working on now, which I call Endogenous Ecology, is about the fundamental principles of nature. One of them being that nature creates systems that are generative and regenerative, that operate at 100% efficiency when healthy. Okay, I also read all of Mae Wan Ho's books that are publicly available. Mae Wan Ho was a brilliant scientist. That she called herself a biophysicist, but in a lot of ways she was a philosopher of biology, but also a very, very serious scientist. The works are quite heady. There's many equations that I don't understand because I don't do the math. Okay, but yeah, I also studied Len Margulis and James Lovelock's Gaia theory, and then also studied biology from reading Len Margulis's books. And Margulis and Mae Wan Ho both were the ones that turned me on to this idea that neo-Darwinism is the biggest problem in the world today. Well, go figure. I mean, that was just so interesting to me, and I have a talk about that specifically. But just to say a couple words about it, many of us didn't realize that there's even, what's the difference between neo-Darwinism and Darwinism, though almost all of us are quite familiar that many people take issue with Darwin and are either creationists or evolutionists or just, there's a lot of surface level stuff like that. But as you dig into it, there's deeper elements of contention as well. That Darwin's original ideas, if you read Darwin's book, Origin of Species, he did not say survival of the fittest. He says struggle for existence. And Darwin also did not appear to be an atheist. He uses creator with a capital C and capital G, God, but his work was co-opted right from the beginning, and it went into another direction, and then a neo-Darwinian camp emerged out of it. And to me, this is what eugenics came out of, okay? And from eugenics to well, watch my talk on it. It's very interesting, okay? But back to the principles of nature, that one of the principles of nature is that nature builds systems that are generative and regenerative, okay? So that is a big piece of understanding the whole picture, is that And like I said, every action that we take, every decision we make and action we take can either have a beneficial or a detrimental effect on our environment. That's almost a direct quote from Aldo Leopold as well, who was a famous wildland ecologist who started the Gila Wilderness, which was one of the first, if not the first, wilderness area in the United States. Aldo Leopold. His early work was called The Land Ethic, which is a hard-to-find book. I have not been able to put my hands on it yet. But his book, A Sand County Almanac, is a nice read. It's readily available. But in any case, this is a very important principle to consider, because one of the things that, if it comes to a blanket recommendation of, hey, who should you check out? Well, I really, off the top of my head, I'm going to say that you should check out James Corbett of thecorbettreport.com. But even he has his own biases. But watch some of his documentaries, corbettreport.com, that will really help to open your mind about some of the factors that led us up to the position that we're in. In lieu of that, you could check out John Taylor Gatto, who spoke. He's got a book called Dumbing Us Down, Weapons of Mass Instruction, and another one called Underground History of the American Education System. And if you were also to read G. Edward Griffin's Creature from Jekyll Island, wow, this is going to open up your mind to how we got to the place that we are. Allan Savory with Holistic Management. I highly, highly, highly recommend the book. But I know few people will actually get their hands on the book. It's a little harder to locate, and it's still an expensive book. But it's about much more than just working with ruminant animals. But in general, it is about the factor that all of the grasslands, herblands, and prairie lands of the world were created by the herd and predator system, created and maintained. And that desertification, the loss of biodiversity, and the loss of the ability to store water and energy on arid lands, semi-arid, becoming arid, is the greatest threat to the habitability of our planet. Okay, if you were to read those 3 books, and there are others also that speak about the creation of fiat currency and the Federal Reserve System. That's what The Creature from Jekyll Island is about. Ron Paul's book, End the Fed. I have not read that yet, but I think it's probably quite thorough on the matter. Okay, but really, when it comes to a recommendation, it's hard to recommend any one person that has a fully holistic knowledge, because nearly everyone who speaks effectively was kind of thoroughly indoctrinated and formed these biases, as I was describing earlier. It's also, there's so much information out there now about metabolic health, quantum biology. I really recommend Sara Pugh, but I could list off a big list of names in that department. Max Guyen out of Australia is a good educator these days. There's a couple younger folks, men named Decentralized Health, and these women with Quantum Biology podcast. They're good. And then there's more qualified professionals such as Paul Mason with Low Carb Down Under, and I could just continue rattling off names about health and wellness, but the point being, it's come a long way, and despite the fact that knowledge around health and wellness and metabolic health and resiliency has come so far, many people still don't know the basic story of Ancel Keys and then Weston Price and the formation of the American Food Health Pyramid. And this is, again, why it's so important that you diversify your investigations a bit, because you can begin to see a thread running contiguous throughout this whole weaving, the tapestry of reality that we experience. One thing that can be worthwhile to consider, if you can allow your mind to be open to this degree, is that is that we're all familiar with this kind of debates around religion. And a lot of people like to say, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. Well, one thing that's kind of a folly about that, and I'm kind of really just growing into this myself recently, because it's something I used to say too. I'm more spiritual than religious. But what we're doing when we say that is we're directly equating the word religion and our thought process about religion with the church establishment. And the church establishment is more akin really to the state than it is to religion. Religion, we're able to take religion and embody it just in the way that we use that word, oh, I'm spiritual, okay? Because the church as an entity, as a power-maintaining entity, is, again, it's more like the state. And that is actually the origin of the use of the word fascism, okay? This word came into usage through Mussolini's aligning his political agenda with the Vatican. Okay, that's how the word was actually first used, was to mean an aligning of church and state. That's what fascism originally meant. Now, I know people think it means something different now, okay, because words get changed around, all right? But to me, I'm kind of old school in this regard. And to me, fascism still means a joining of church and state. And the church establishment, what I was going to say about that is if you go back and look at the origins of Christianity, we can see how only certain books were allowed to be put into the official Bible. And that's what's called the canon, the church canon. Okay? And other ones were excluded. Elaine Pagels has a nice little book called The Gnostic Gospels about this, and this is what her work focused on. Okay, but there's many others as well. And of course, many people are familiar with such things as the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library or the Lost Books of the Bible. This idea, and not just an idea, this reality, because we have the publications, unless they were just made up. I mean, the thing with the Nag Hammadi Library is that these were texts found in ancient clay jugs. They were unearthed from a cave in Egypt in 1945 and then published for the first time in 1980. And the idea is that they had been buried for a long time. And the idea, once again, is that they prove that there were many more books of the Bible, or of religious texts that were not incorporated into the Bible. Okay, so that's what I mean about the church is more like a state entity, though it is a religious entity, not a secular entity, as governments are supposed to be. But once again, this is the origin of the word fascism, okay? But what the point that I'm really making here is to say that this is a much larger story, and it in fact is the story of science, which is what my last two little videos were about, is to say that only what is accepted in the mainstream, and another way to look at this is only what sells products or sells what, the sellers want to put out there is what's accepted. And all other ideas that run contrary to mainstream get swept under the rug or get burned at the stake, quite literally. Okay? Throughout history, there have been many people that have literally been burned at the stake. We're, of course, in the West here, many people are familiar with like the Salem witch hunts and the persecution against women, but many men throughout history were persecuted as well. Like Galileo, you know what I mean? And Socrates put to death. The story goes on and on. Many of the early Christians were murdered for their faith. Okay, this story goes on and on and on. And it never stopped. It never stopped. It's an ongoing story that we're living with the reality. And today, there's a popular thing that people say about, the patriarchy. And I know that there are women that married horrible men, okay, and had miserable relationships, but it's not it's kind of a dangerous slippery slope to blame everything on the patriarchy when there's some element of just like man hating associated with that. Because if you do really educate yourself and dig into these things, you'll find that there's a lot of good men too. There's a lot of men that have no interest in mistreating or oppressing women. Okay? And even within men that thought that women should not vote or women should stay home within a traditional role, that doesn't mean that they disrespected them and wanted to oppress them. That just is part of a traditional culture systems. But perhaps what I'm trying to say here is that a better scapegoat than the patriarchy is the banking cartel. And within G. Edward Griffin's book, A Creature from Jekyll Island, he points out that he uses the words cartel and cabal, a banking cabal, within the strict definition of those terms. He's not using it like in some conspiracy theorist way, oh, the cabal. No, he's using it in the actual real definition of those words, cartel and cabal. And there is, of course, a banking, well, of course, once you educate yourself to these things. And once again, John Taylor Gatto, his book, particularly the one called The Underground History of American Education, it's quite decisive in pointing out how there were real influential figures who were pulling the strings behind creating the American education system. And also, as I had mentioned, James Corbett's documentaries. I highly recommend the series. I think it's maybe just 2 that are called How Big Oil Conquered the World. And this is it's a very similar story of how the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the Morgans and Cecil Rhodes and, these very influential and richest men in the world at their times were pulling the strings. Okay? And they most indeed did set up the banking cartel, along with other kind of sects of the world population, which are rather infamous for that behavior. Okay? So who do I recommend? Well, there's a list of folks who I recommend. And once again, what I'm saying is to really investigate what's going on in the world from a holistic perspective. It is quite necessary that we diversify our investigation. To me, what I'm saying about Allan Savory's work lately is that, and I had mentioned Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock, they're the inventors of the Gaia theory. Okay, and Gaia theory was not a woo-woo idea about the goddess Mother Earth, though that is what the word means, Gaia, and that is a great thing to believe in. I think that that's awesome. But the Gaia theory was very serious science about how the living conditions on our planet are maintained. It said the temperature, the oxidation state, and the gaseous composition of our atmosphere are maintained and regulated and made the way that they are by the actions of living organisms. The respiration and digestion and behavioral patterns of organisms. And we're primarily talking about microorganisms, which actually make up the great bulk of the world's population of organisms, but we're also talking about macroorganisms. And of course, back to Allan Savory, the behavior patterns and in correspondence with the management patterns, which was originally predators and now mostly humans, of ruminant animals. Okay? So anyway, what I'm going to just close out by saying here is that to me, the Gaia theory, I mentioned soil food web, holistic management and adaptive grazing. I mentioned Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and we can also say, healthy forestry, healthy wetlands. And then up to today, there's present more defined science around what is the soil carbon sponge. Like folks like Walter Yenny, Watershed Alliance, and there's many people that speak about the soil carbon sponge, but it's not promoted in the algorithms, okay? And there could be a reason for that, because there is a big agenda being pushed by the banking cartel to push forward the narrative of overpopulation, which is an anti-human agenda. Oh, humans are the problem, get rid of the humans, blah, blah, blah. So, back to what I was saying, nature builds systems that are generative and regenerative, and human beings have to make a choice. Do we want to be part of nature? Do we want to act in accordance with nature's needs and the what the environment is asking of us, or do we want to ignore that and move towards transhumanism? In which case, maybe the Earth is overpopulated. But there have been many, many, many people that spoke about this throughout the centuries, this population issue. And there's been a huge agenda as well as an ethos that has grown behind the narrative. It was very widely discussed in the 1970s and 80s, this overpopulation problem. But I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I believe it's something like all of the world's population at the density of New York City could fit into the state of Texas. Okay? That's something to consider, and we should all look into that. But I will just tell you from my own personal experience that I know that there are many cities all over the world that are overcrowded. But if you go and spend a couple years, even a couple months living out in an area like I do, you're going to find out the Earth is most certainly not overpopulated because there ain't nobody around. The amount of animals and life in general, birds, bees, all insects and all other animals is declining. And it is actually not because of this like human encroachment. It's a more complicated story that it does have to do with humans, but really it's a very long-term story. So yeah, so that's it really. The thread running contiguous throughout this whole thing is that there are major agendas at play, and we have to be very careful when we're listening to any one source of information that they're not themselves being co-opted and playing into the hands of these larger agendas, and that the way we can be careful of that, the way that we can protect ourselves from falling a victim to those same follies and fallacies is through discernment. And all of this stuff, at the end of the day, it will, if you follow what I'm saying, it will lead you to this belief that education and knowledge plus experience is what makes wisdom, is critical to the health and wellness of our species. And that the opposite is ignorance, it's idiocracy, it's all types of horrible ideas get propagated and foisted upon the people. So yeah, one last thing to say about it, which is, I'm touching on, is this principle of fecundity, that humans can, every decision we make and action we take can have a beneficial or detrimental effect on nature. Well, once again, I'd like to say this in almost every talk I make these days, is that I'm sitting in a house right now that I built with my own hands. It costs very little to build, that has $0 in heating and cooling costs. It's one of those things to understand about, are you living a life that's completely wasteful when you don't actually have to? And it's not all about transitioning to renewable power. Like, it's more about lessening your footprint and increasing your regenerative capacity, where you're building up soil health around within your entire frame of influence, scope of influence. So part of that, once again, is educating each other, and like I said before, that's why I'm doing my best to continue my studies so that I can learn how to best articulate upon these things and share them, because I do believe that it is needed. Okay. Thank you everyone for watching today. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this or felt it to be valuable. And I do mean that, share it, because it won't per se be shared by the algorithms of AI, which AI controls all of social media now. Hopefully everyone realizes that is part of this agenda as well. It's under the control of the banking cartel and cabal, right? So it is incumbent upon us all to share useful information, to diversify our sources of information, and yes, to share, because sharing is caring. Thank you so much. I hope you're well today. I'm going to leave it at that for now.